Aloha and welcome to Think Tech, where we're raising public awareness about technology, energy, globalism, and diversification. As part of the Think Tech series, today's show is Global Connections, and I'm your host, Carlos Juarez. I'm delighted to be joined today by a very special guest, Jon Davidann. I'll say a word in a moment about him, but more importantly, I just want to remind you that we're coming to you live from Pioneer Plaza here in the heart of downtown Honolulu. Joining me today, Dr. Jon Davidann, a historian, an expert on a range of issues, but particularly as a conversation today, we're going to look at issues related to Sino-Japanese relations. It's a tense moment at the moment in East Asia. You've had a chance to return recently from some travels in China and other parts of East Asia. But first, I'd like to also remind our viewers that, our listeners and viewers, that we broadcast live on the internet at 2 and at 4 every weekday. All of our shows are streamed on Ustream.com and Spreaker.com. And if you'd like links to our live streams as well as any previous broadcasts, you can find all of them at ThinkTechHawaii.com. If you'd like to join us here in our downtown gallery for any of our shows, be sure to write it that's J-A-Y, at ThinkTechHawaii.com. So again, turn to our guest. Jon, thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to this conversation. I know you've come back with recent travels to Asia, but maybe for some of our listeners, if you can give us a quick snapshot. You're a historian specializing in various areas. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and your expertise?
Okay, thanks very much for having me on, Carlos. So I'm a historian of U.S. East Asian relations. I studied at the University of Minnesota. I've written several books on U.S. East Asian relations, and most recently a book on the period before World War II, focusing really on the causes of the Pacific War. So I have a real strong interest in East Asia, and I've traveled a lot to East Asia. So there were some things on this most recent trip that kind of piqued my interest, and I guess that's why I thought it would be a good time to come on the show and talk a little bit about it. So.
Excellent. No, so again, always interesting for us to gauge and get expert opinion. Like you've just mentioned, you had an opportunity to be in the region, and while we always observe things from here, you get a different sense of the pulse of maybe perspectives from people on the ground. Yeah. You were in China specifically, also travels into Vietnam for another recent conference and activities. I wonder, and maybe just to help provide some of the context, I want to talk today particularly about recent tensions. This is a moment where in East Asia we've got China, major, important player. We have Japan, another critical country and strong ally for the U.S., but some recent tensions. So just give us a quick snapshot. What are the tensions themselves? I mean, give us some context, and then we'll try to unravel the puzzle.
Right. So what really struck me when I was in China this last time was that I happened to I had a free night, and so I turned on the TV in my dorm room in Beijing, and I was flipping through the channels, and I counted 105 channels, and I'm estimating about 10 to 15 of those channels were on World War II dramas featuring kind of evil-looking Japanese characters and heroic Chinese characters who were resisting Japanese oppression. Now, I had never noticed this before, and if you add that to the discussions that I had with Chinese scholars and just kind of regular Chinese on the street this last visit, I think there's a little more cause for us to pay, let's say, closer attention to that relationship right now, because I think that there's the tensions that have been there historically are heating up a little bit more. So let me back up a little bit and talk about the tensions historically. So when we look at the tension between China and Japan, they've really been, most recently, of course, it's the tensions around the Yasukuni Shrine visit in December 2013, just really last month.
This is the Japanese Prime Minister making a decision to visit this controversial, well, the issue is controversial. When he visits it sends signals, it sends a message. I mean, I know many of our viewers will understand this, but say a brief word just to clarify.
Right, so the Yasukuni Shrine is a Shinto shrine, and it has the remains of some Class A war criminals from World War II enshrined there. And the Shintos consider these, they don't call them war criminals, they consider them to be gods, actually, after they die. So this has been a point of controversy between China and Japan for a long time. according to the Chinese, these are war criminals who committed atrocities in China, some of them.
Yeah, yeah.
And according to the Japanese, they're just paying homage to war dead, and they're honoring their patriotic effort in the Pacific War. So you're going to get really different opinions, but nonetheless, it's a flashpoint for Sino-Japanese relations, and it's controversial whenever a prime minister goes there. So that's one thing. And then there's, of course, there's a Senkaku dispute.
These are the islands that are both countries are contesting. And
that's correct. These are islands south and west of Japan, to the west of Okinawa. And these are islands that the Japanese, until 2012, actually were owned privately by a Japanese citizen. And then in 2012, the owner decided to sell them. So the question was, who's going to buy these? And a real conservative guy who was very wealthy in Japan had threatened to buy them. And this made a lot of people in China angry. So instead, the Japanese government bought them. At least this is the Japanese argument, is the Japanese government bought these islands, and they said they bought them to keep them out of the hands of this very conservative Japanese guy who was going to, make all kinds of trouble for the Sino-Japanese relationship. Well, it didn't matter, because the
response in China was pretty.
The act of the purchase itself really, it nationalized the islands. And so they became sovereign Japanese territory. At least that's the Japanese interpretation of what happened. The Chinese will say they're disputed territory. And this needs to be resolved by some negotiations between the two, but the Japanese actually have to admit that they're disputed territory first. So that's a second issue that has come into the relationship quite recently. Now there's several other issues. Sometimes they're one-time events. But I think
taken together, they kind of add to some of this, right?
They add to this, and then there's some themes that run throughout the relationship since really the late 1980s. These kinds of tensions and the growth of these tensions. So, 2010, there was a fishing boat incident near the Senkakus. A Chinese trawler ran into some Japanese Coast Guard vessels. This was a blow-up. 2005, the Japanese issued a new edition of a textbook that talked about the Nanjing Massacre. Only the Japanese actually refer to this as the Nanjing Incident. They don't refer to it as a massacre.
Like an incident, like a little thing that happened, a little minor incident.
In defense of the Japanese, if you translate almost anything of that kind of event of that kind of character, it comes out as incident. But still, the Japanese textbooks gave it about a paragraph. They didn't really talk about casualties at all. And so, and we of course know that there were casualties. There's disputes about how many casualties, but we know that.
And the criticism, did it play out in China? Did they raise objections?
That's correct. So the textbook came out. There are reporters in Japan, Chinese reporters in Japan, who convey this back to China.
So it raised a big
and then the Chinese government gets upset. They transmit to the Chinese people. The Chinese people go out on the streets and protest. So you have an incident. You have a diplomatic incident. So the Chinese canceled a diplomatic visit to Japan. So that's another issue. The textbook issue is there and kind of boils on and off. So there are several of these. Now, one of the things that's going on, one of the kind of the underlying issues here, that the history in World War II, those are underlying issues. But you also have the Sino-Japanese rivalry, which is very current. I mean, it's right now, it's with us. The Japanese in 2005, when I was there and witnessing this, I was in Japan actually in 2005, and witnessed this incident, the Japanese really felt like they were quite worried about China overtaking their economy. And then them becoming the number 3 economy. So there's some of that, this feeling like the Japanese now are the 3rd, and so they're once again a kind of junior partner, and there's definitely resentment about that. So there is that kind of plain old just national rivalry between China and Japan. So
so this is all part of that. And of course, the other element, while we're talking about the Sino-Japanese focus, the fact that Japan is such an important partner of the U.S., an important ally for us. There's an aspect of that, the U.S.
That's right.
role and interest. And if I'm not mistaken, maybe clarify for us, there was also some attention in the media. You had a chance to share some insights. A new U.S. ambassador in Japan, Caroline Kennedy, recently arrived, made some statements, got into the press. What was the issue there?
So Ambassador Kennedy, it's really two things. This last thing was something that I had some commentary on. The last thing was the Japanese practice of herding and killing dolphins in a town in Japan, and they do this for commercial purposes, and they do it for they've done this for a long time. So there's a history here, and the Japanese would argue that this is a local practice. It's a cultural and a historical practice, and so it's not that big a deal. American environmentalists got upset about it. So I was called in to talk about, what's the American stake in this, and Ambassador Kennedy issued a tweet. Well, that's new in and of itself, that the ambassador actually is issuing a tweet, right? It's like tweeting. So she issued a tweet condemning this practice. And so, and then, but previous to this, in December 2013, right after she had taken up her post, she also issued a statement after the Yasukuni Shrine visit, disapproving of that, saying that the United States did not approve of this visit. So I think you put those two things together and you see an American, in the midst of these tensions, you see an American approach which is evolving, which is changing. It used to be that we stood foursquare behind Japan. And it was, foursquare no matter what happened. Now the Americans are realizing that the stakes, the tensions and the stakes in East Asia have risen to the point where, I'm putting words in the American diplomat's mouth. I think they're thinking that they have to get involved and put a little pressure on Japan to not be quite so bellicose with China, and to look for openings to negotiate diplomatically with China. And so I'm hoping that's what they're saying.
So it's a game going on, a chess game, where not just Japan and China, but you've got the U.S. factored in, where, like you've described now, that relationship with Japan is evolving, and some of it is not just U.S.-Japan, but our own ability to then deal with China.
That's correct. I mean, that
quite important.
The Sino-American relationship has become extremely important, of course, and now we have to balance those interests.
And what about the current administration in Japan? Of course, any person who looks at the history of Japan's governments over the last 4 decades, for many years they used to have a record every 8 or 10 months there'd be a new prime minister. And in this case, the Abe administration is not a totally new. I mean, it is a new administration, but he's a returning prime minister from got a new regime, and that's significant. But maybe if you could help us place this in the context as well, this new administration, somewhat, I guess, how could we paint it? Either bold or reformist, or putting in place some important changes. And essentially, part of this is coming under that time frame where they're shaking things up.
That's
trying
true.
to revitalize the economy and even maybe politically. How do things stand at the moment? What's a snapshot of this new administration?
So the Abe Shinzo administration is a fairly new administration, and of course he served back in 2007.
In one of those brief times.
That's right. And interestingly, in 2007 there were tensions stemming from the 2005 incidents, and Abe actually went to China and negotiated, and those incidents, those tensions subsided. So he's been involved on the diplomatic side of this as well, but he's on the conservative side. He's an LDP party member, and he leans more towards the conservative side in Japan, and I think he's trying to establish Japan as a more independent actor in East Asia. He understands that China has risen. That China represents an economic threat. Threat is not quite the right word, or a challenge, or an opportunity, really. And he also recognizes that, given Japan's current approach to military policy, that the Japanese, there's not that much the Japanese can do on their own. They're really very beholden to the Americans right now in terms of defense policy. So Abe, I think, is trying to strengthen Japan's hand in hopefully he's trying to strengthen the hand so he can negotiate with the Chinese. I'm not as confident about that as I was 12 months ago. I'm a little more concerned about the other side of this, that a misstep by both of these parties, which you've been seeing many of, could result in at least a skirmish.
So the tensions are there, and I mean, a very important issue, and there's so much behind this. I think what you've made clear is that, you know, history matters. We need to understand it. We have to have that context, and as we continue, in a moment, I want to take a short break, and we'll be back, but we're going to get a better understanding of what are some of the causes, the underlying causes of these tensions, what are some of the potential, where do we go from here? Or what are some possible scenarios? So join us in just a moment. We'll take a short break here. We're talking with Jon Davidann about important tensions in the Sino-Japanese relations, and we'll be back in just a minute. So stay tuned for more on the story.
I'm Hong Jiang, host for Asia in Review on Tuesdays.
And I'm David Day, host for Asian Review on Thursdays. Both of us broadcast our respective shows at 4 p.m.
And my topics tend to deal with questions related to environment, culture, history, and sometimes human rights.
And my shows tend to be on international business, foreign policy, geopolitics, and national security. And you can watch our shows live on the ThinkTech website at ThinkTechHawaii.com.
And you can also watch us on YouTube or Olalo.
So come join us on Thursdays at 4 p.m. I'm David Day.
And on Tuesdays at 4 p.m., I'm Hong Jiang.
Aloha.
Aloha.
And we're back, and we're live, and we're here on ThinkTech. This is Global Connections. I'm your host, Carlos Juarez. We're joined today by Jon Davidann, a historian with a lot of expertise and knowledge and recent travels over to China, other parts of Southeast Asia, and helping us make sense of some some tensions that are currently, particularly between Japan and China, the Sino-Japanese relationship. It's a complex one. There are many layers going on, as we've heard, and as we look to unravel what are some of the underlying causes, clearly an understanding of history, an understanding of geopolitics, an understanding of even the current administrations, whether it's in China, but particularly in Japan, where we see under the new leadership of Abe, a lot of things are at play, a lot of changes. So give us maybe following the discussion, some of the what you might see as some of the main causes behind this.
Right. So I think the causes break down into two areas. The first area is historical memory. And while in this country, of course, we might tend to downplay the issue of historical memory. In East Asia, it's very live, and not just between China and Japan, but the Koreans have a long memory of Japanese occupation, colonial occupation in World War II. The Philippines, all of Southeast Asia really still resents what Japan did in World War II. So the historical memory is part of it, and then the geopolitical issues. This is the second leg of this. The causes of this. So essentially, what happened in the Pacific War, or in what China refers to as the China War of 1937 to 1945, is the Japanese invaded China proper, the southeast part of China, with all of the major cities, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Nanjing, conquered all of that territory, and in the process did some really bad things. I mean, they committed really terrible atrocities, especially in Nanjing, where the Chinese military actually just escaped and fled the scene of that. And of course, it was the capital of China, and the Chinese had actually defended Shanghai very well, and this enraged the Japanese military.
So they took a bit of heavy toll on.
They went on a rampage in Nanjing, raping and pillaging. I mean, I've read accounts of Japanese troop transports coming into Nanjing University, picking up truckloads of women and going off with them, and the women coming back, after the weekend, talking about being gang raped and just terribly abused. So this is a really live issue in China.
Hard to bury. I mean, it remains under
it really is a brand
new
museum in Nanjing on the massacre, another museum on the China War in Beijing, right next to the Marco Polo Bridge. The Chinese are not letting this go.
And as you described, even just sitting in your room there watching the news, I mean, it's alive and on a daily basis. People are seeing,
on a daily basis, people talk about this. They refer to this. So it's a really powerful issue. And so the other part of this is, after the war, there was a kind of what I would call a freeze in this historical memory. because of the Cold War. 2 years after the end
Kind of kept a lid on
the
it.
Pacific War. That's right. The disputes between China and Japan were really non-existent in the time period of the Cold War. China had its own problems. Japan was really under the nuclear shield of the United States, considered the United States bulwark against communism.
So this is one of those examples in the post-Cold War world. We see it in many places where, in some ways, that more openness and the end of that tension of the Cold War allowed this to resurface, and whether it's the textbook issue or just even today the technologies and greater awareness, people kind of continue to fuel that narrative continues.
So the post-Cold War period has allowed these memories to
more space.
reemerge. Now the Japanese haven't. I mean, here I'm going to criticize the Japanese, quite frankly, because the Japanese have done a very bad job of apologizing for their actions. They have at times tried to apologize, but they've never apologized completely. When they did apologize, in 1993, I was in Japan as a graduate student, and the Prime Minister Hosokawa gave the first kind of real apology to the Chinese. And 7 days later, he visited Yasukuni Shrine.
Rub it in the face.
That's right. So it was an apology, but not an apology. And on issues of compensation for the prostitutes that the Japanese army used, the Japanese were very hesitant at first, and finally they set up a fund, and the fund wasn't enough. And so the apology project has been botched by the Japanese, and the Chinese are well aware of this. And at this point, every time the Japanese try to apologize, the Chinese bring it back up as this botched apology, and they can just bring up all of these atrocity issues that the Japanese committed. So so you have the historical memory, and then you have the way that the historical memory is feeding into the geopolitical situation.
So it fuels some of the tensions itself.
It does
there.
indeed. I mean,
and in ways where maybe whether it's in Japan, you have either nationalist tensions that or leaders, or because I have to guess that the visit by the Prime Minister to the shrine, a lot of it is driven by his own domestic pressure. You've got to do this. It's part of what you're expected.
He's trying to appease the right wing. And I would say to him, if I could talk to him directly, I would say, don't do it, because the right wing in Japan is very small.
And we have our Prime Minister saying, or not a Prime Minister, our ambassador saying, hey, not a good idea.
Right.
But
and I really think that I mean, we'll talk about this more in a minute, but the ambassador is on the right track right now in terms of these tensions and this problem. So, the historical stuff has flowed into the geopolitical tension. So, for instance, in 2005, when I was in Japan and the textbook issue came up, then what happens in China is the Chinese government criticizes this. The Chinese population reads about the criticism, gets mobilized, and then the Chinese government can manage this. They can either let the protests go and get really big, or they can keep them smaller. In 2005, the leadership decided they wanted to keep the protests small, and so they discouraged high school students from going on protests. In 2012, when the Senkaku incident happened, they took the lid off, and they let all kinds of protests take place.
We understand that from, we just mentioned like the domestic politics in Japan. In another way, China is playing a similar game. They're either allowing somehow space or tensions to bubble up, or they contain them as needed in ways that might either help them politically.
Right. Yeah. But the difference there is, of course, China is a democracy. It might be
no, the other way around.
I mean,
Japan.
Japan is a democracy. It might be an elite democracy, but China is not. And so when the government controls all of the media, and defines the message very kind of tightly, boy, the results on popular opinion are dramatic. So you see this in China, that the popular opinion against Japan has just grown and grown. And I can see a difference between 2012 and 2013. And I guess that's what concerns me the most. Governments don't fight wars alone. the people
Yeah,
of those nations
and
fight
rallying
those
the
wars.
opinions
That's right.
there,
So
so
this is
remarkable.
it's a concern. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And back, again, as the historical context is there, but that also fuels the geopolitical agenda, as you described now.
Right.
And the other element that we haven't mentioned yet, but of course it's another recent phenomenon. It is this ADIZ, this announcement by the Chinese government. Tell us a little bit about that, just to place that in the context. This is their decision to announce airspace that has to be more carefully controlled.
It's really kind of weird, honestly.
Yeah.
So if the Japanese have been provocative with Yasukuni Shrine visits, then the Chinese are being quite provocative with this ADIZ, which is Aviation Defense Information Zone.
And it requiring any flights that are coming over there have to sort of report or check in.
That's correct. Now it's not the Chinese no-fly zone. It's not their sovereignty zone.
It's a broader, larger.
It's not their territorial airspace zone, and they don't claim it as that. They say this is not our territorial air.
But
they call it an early warning zone, which they're just parsing this. But they've claimed this as a zone that they're going to be monitoring, and that any craft that enters this airspace has to inform the Chinese government that they're entering the airspace. And so this is a kind of a weird game that the Chinese are playing. We can talk about this more a little bit later. So that came up in November 2013. It just happened recently.
A couple months ago, of course.
And of course the Japanese were really outraged by this. I mean, understandably. This is a provocation.
Changing the rules and claiming, really a space that's beyond what's recognized.
It does not exist in international law. There is no such thing, but the Chinese did it anyhow. So the Chinese actually have a little bit of a history of kind of soft peddling international law. They kind of play to their own rules, actually. And I think, honestly, the sooner the Americans understand that about China, the better off we'll be. That we kind of have to negotiate them in real space, not on the basis of international law.
Absolutely. Now you were describing maybe again the context of our own new leadership there in Japan in the form of our new ambassador, and what you were referring to, how she's on to. I mean, what is your sense other than these public pronouncements she's made? Has she done anything else or been signaling any other either new line for American policy there?
No, I mean the truth is, I don't think Carolyn Kennedy, the ambassador, knows much about Japan. The ambassadorship is a political position, so Obama's or the president's allies, those who have been important in his campaigns, have given a lot of money, typically end up with this ambassadorship. It's a really bad way of doing an ambassadorship, but this is the way it's been. I think it's probably her instincts as a politician. Taking over, and hopefully she got a really good briefing from the State Department before she went out, and she's getting some communication some advice from the State Department about the issue of the Senkakus and the rest, and the Yasukuni Shrine and all the rest of this. But I do think the important change here is that the American government previously never officially criticized the Yasukuni Shrine visits.
Exactly.
This is an important departure, because what it means is the Americans understand, I think it means that the American government understands better the impact of these visits and the tensions, the Sino-Japanese tensions, and the way this could inflame those tensions. The Americans cannot control what China does. But they're an alliance partner with Japan. And Japan is highly dependent upon the United States right now. So we've got leverage there. And so this is why I say I think she's on the right track, because she's utilizing some of that leverage to say to the Japanese, look, it's not a blank check anymore. You're going to have to be a little more careful in your East Asian relations. And we're going to watch you.
And some of it is, I would guess, the context is also where the new government in Japan is trying to flex itself a little. It's trying to redefine and open the question of what is their own future sort of foreign policy, but more specifically defense and security. And as we come back, we'll take another short break in a minute. We'll try to unravel some of that, because as we look at what can be done, what's ahead, what are the potential either scenarios or options or ways. Again, while we're focused here on the Sino-Japanese relationship, clearly the U.S. role is significant because we have an important alliance with Japan, but we're at a time now where we're seeing important changes in the Japanese leadership. So let's leave that for now and come back to that. We're going to take another short break, and our listeners out there, please hold on, and we'll be back with more on this story after this break.
Aloha, I'm Nicole Horry for ThinkTech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaii Foreign Trade Zone No. 9 has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBET, the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone's mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Nicole Horry. Mahalo.
And we're back, and we're live, and we're here at ThinkTech Hawaii's Global Connections Show. I'm your host, Carlos Juarez, and we're being joined today by Jon Davidann, a historian and expert on East Asia, on Japan-U.S. relations, recent travels that took him to China most recently, and Southeast Asia, and giving us a good understanding, a good context on the pulse of what is, at the moment, a pretty tense environment between Japan and China. It's a complex one. We've got a lot of players going on, a lot of issues. We have to understand the historical context, which remains relevant, and that has an impact on really the evolving geopolitics. And one of the things, Darren, I want to maybe ask you to share, I mean, both from your own impressions there recently in Asia, but also as we're seeing, reports and more information about public opinion shifting and maybe pulsing that opinion in Japan in particular. How are these things playing out in Japanese domestic?
Right. So the recent tensions, the fishing boat incident in 2010, the Senkakus in 2012, and then the ADIZ just recently now have played out and created a very negative public opinion on the part of the Japanese towards China. So the Prime Minister actually does a poll every year, a poll of public opinion. Some of the questions concern Sino-Japanese relations, and those numbers are the highest they've been in terms of negativity towards China since the relationship began. If you ask Japanese, how do you feel about the Sino-Japanese relationship, about 90% are negative on it. If you ask them if they trust Japan, and to my mind, this is a really important number, about 88 to 90% say they don't trust China. And so this, you couple this with the Chinese public opinion, which has become, I think, increasingly negative on Japan in the last couple of years. And then you look at what's going on in Japan. Now, the Japanese public opinion is more diverse because, again, it's a democracy. But there's a very strong negative image of China right now. Tours to China, vacation tours to China, have been cut in about half since the Senkaku incident. One of the impacts of the Senkaku incident, or the Diaoyu incident, this is the Chinese called Diaoyu, the Japanese call it Senkaku, is that trade between China and Japan has taken a hit. Trade overall is down about 13%, automobile purchases down about 10%. And now this is variable because in August, on about the anniversary of the Senkakus, the trade was really down. And then September, after the first anniversary of the Senkakus, when I think Japanese businessmen assumed, okay, it's over, this is going to recede. Then, and probably Chinese business as well. Then business between China and Japan went up. But that's another concern, quite frankly. One of the things that creates stability in East Asia is the trade relations between all of these Asian nations.
Yeah, they're all interconnected. They're interdependent. So it doesn't. Ultimately, it's going to hurt you if you increase those tensions.
And the hope is that the leadership understands this, and they're not going to play games with their trade, with their economy. But there's been some damage. There's been some economic damage as fallout of the Senkaku dispute. So,
and as I recall, some of the protests were specifically targeting Japanese either firms or factories or more visible elements.
Yeah.
I have to wonder,
Yeah.
as this often happens, where a savvy business person has to kind of go a little bit under the radar, maybe change the name of your company or put another face to it or something.
Yeah, I mean, the Japanese don't like to do that, quite frankly.
Yeah.
They don't like going through intermediaries.
Yeah.
They like having control
Sure.
over their enterprises. But I mean, it's possible in the future they might do this kind of thing. I mean, my hope is that you take 6 months to cool this thing off, and then maybe July through August, the Japanese and the Chinese can work on something. I'm not sure that that's going to happen, but that's a hope. And I do think, in spite of the damage to trade, that there's still a very strong economic relationship between the Chinese and the Japanese, and the Japanese and the Koreans, and the Japanese and the Chinese and the Vietnamese. I mean, that whole area is just booming economically.
Of course, and it's booming in a way where it's a result of that interdependence that's going on. So they're not doing it all on their own. They're really
Exactly.
part and parcel together.
And the Americans have helped in this because they provided a platform in Japan whereby Japan would expand peacefully after World War II and without military aggression. And now it looks like that might change. This is the other piece of the public opinion that was in this recent report, and that's that the two different newspapers reported on Japanese public opinion concerning changes to self-defense policy. The first newspaper, the Asahi Shimbun, gave a poll, and that poll was actually fairly negative on changes to self-defense policy. There were only 29% in favor of changes to self-defense policy. And I think self-defense policy can be construed to include changes to the Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which of course is the self-defense articulation of Japanese policy.
And that's the policy that does not allow them to build a sort of a more offensive type military, or that constrains them to kind of just simply be defending the state.
That's correct. But it does allow for self-defense.
Yes.
So there's been a lot of confusion, a lot of obfuscation surrounding Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. But so the current Prime Minister, Abe, wants to change that. He's made that part
some
very
of his
clear.
support comes from what you might describe as either conservative or nationalists who, on one hand, they see a need for Japan to kind of, either, is it a mixture of pressure to, gosh, how shall I say it? They either that Japan should have a greater role in the international community, or more that the changing dynamics require them to take more control over their defense versus depending on the U.S.
He says it's a greater role in the international community, and Japan is a peaceful nation, and Japan never wants to start another war. But the truth is that the Japanese feel threatened by this. Now, there was another newspaper, the Nikkei Shimbun, which is a little more conservative. They reported the potential for changing the Constitution at 49% support. That's a significant difference. But even at 50%, the thing is, to change the Japanese Constitution, you have to have a 2/3 majority in a national referendum.
So they're not quite there.
They're not there yet in terms of actually changing that. And short of that, I'm not sure that Abe can meet his goals in terms of remilitarizing Japan, and now they're definitely putting more money into the military. They have the 3% rise in the
increases
in the military budget for the next year. But it's I think the situation in East Asia is really evolving. And one of the things that's really important for Americans is that we get good information about this rapidly evolving situation. I mean, so that's one of the things that's really important. And then I also think that the Americans need to understand what the Chinese are up to and what the Japanese are up to. It's pretty clear that the Japanese want to remilitarize to protect themselves from China.
And redefine the relationship that we've had with them
Right,
somewhat.
and probably some more independence from the United States. But the Chinese now, we're not absolutely certain what the Chinese are up to. They're being kind of provocative in the East and the South China Seas. When I was in China, I went to a talk on the South China and the East China Sea disputes. It was by a professor at the Naval Institute in Shanghai, in Nanjing. And so in a way, this guy speaks with the voice of the government. It was a very interesting presentation. It was really long, 2 hours. I couldn't believe the students sat there for 2 hours. But so his basic point was twofold. China is going to treat the East and the South China Sea disputes in the same way. They're going to internationalize these disputes, and they're going to militarize these disputes. And I said to the guy, look, I'm fine with internationalizing. That's a good thing, at least in the South China Sea.
Sure.
But I'm a little concerned about militarizing.
Yeah, because that increases the tension even more and the response. Well, these are very important, and as we get a chance, we'll have one final short break, but we're going to come back to finish a discussion here with Jon Davidann. I'm Carlos Juarez, and we're looking at this puzzle of tensions in the Sino-Japanese relations. Join us for just a final session as we come back for more on the story.
We want to thank our underwriters.
Hawaiian Electric Company and its affiliates Maui Electric on Maui and Hawaii Electric Light Company on Hawaii Island are deeply committed to the communities they serve.
Galen Ho is a senior executive of BAE Systems, a global defense, security, and aerospace company.
The High-Tech Development Corporation, the state's leading technology agency, attached to the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism.
Castle and Cook Hawaii, with a time-honored legacy that spans more than 160 years and revolves around its mission of investing in Hawaii, creating communities, and providing for the needs of our state.
Hawaii Gas, formerly the Gas Company, a proponent of the Liquefied Natural Gas Initiative, helping Hawaii achieve its transition to clean energy and a better energy future.
Collateral Analytics, a Hawaii-based tech company empowering the real estate industry with greater and faster access to the tools and data they need to make better informed property investment decisions.
I'm Nicole Horry. Thanks so much for joining us on ThinkTech.
I'm Maria Kashem. See you next time.
And welcome back. We're live, and this is ThinkTech, the Global Connection Show. I'm your host, Carlos Juarez. We're joined today by Jon Davidann, a historian who's given us some great insights, some details about tensions in East Asia between China and Japan, and of course, very complex. We've talked a bit about the U.S. connection, given our close alliance with Japan. We've talked a bit about Japan, and especially changing dynamics in their government, some of even redefining their own self-defense strategy. That's a work in progress itself. One thing I wonder if we might turn to the situation in China. On one hand, we have it's a country that is itself under recent leadership changes. You were describing a recent talk you were able to attend on the China Sea. This was in Beijing.
That's correct. Yes.
An expert coming from China to speak about and give us a quick snapshot, because as you were describing, there was an argument that they were internationalizing both the South China and the East China, and also even suggesting a militarization, and of course a very clever strategy of combining these two, because they are very different, but help us unravel some of that complexity.
So I think if we take militarization first, that'll help us to understand this, because the Chinese have been militarizing the South China Sea for some time. They're building installations there, while the Philippines lives basically off of reef fish in their installations, and they push old military transports onto the reefs and let them rot there.
To become new reefs.
With like 8 soldiers. The Chinese have shiny new concrete installations there that are very impressive, and it's showing their muscle really in the South China Sea. So they've already militarized the South China Sea to a certain extent. In the South China Sea, they're going to continue to militarize a bit more so that they can move themselves into a very strong negotiating position. They don't want to negotiate on international law in the South China Sea. The 1982 Law of the Sea, correct, is not going to help them, actually. So,
and when you say that, is the negotiation then more about their military versus the question of law?
It's actually about taking as much territory as you can and then giving up some of it later.
And so this militarization allows them to sort of kind of encroach and lay claim to...
That's right, and then if they internationalize it, if they bring everybody together and say, okay, let's make a compromise here.
They're from a strong position, right?
That's correct. They can back off on some of their claims and still have quite a lot of the South China Sea. So, but in the East China Sea...
This is the China-Japan
That's
conflict.
correct. This is the Senkaku Dispute. So the Chinese have begun to militarize by announcing the ADIZ and by sending a lot of their ships into the disputed areas. And so they're doing this. The question is, how far are they going to go towards militarizing it? And so if they stop at a certain point, the internationalization of this will mean that they expect the Japanese to come to the table, and maybe even other parties, to negotiate this on an international basis. The Japanese don't want this. The Japanese consider the Senkakus to be
their land,
it's their
and
sovereign
not up for
territory. That's correct.
negotiation.
So it's a very interesting, very clever approach that they've come upon. I don't know how long they'll stick with that approach, but I do think the internationalization of these areas has the potential to lead to resolutions, especially in the South China Sea. But possibly if the Japanese can give a little bit in the East China Sea, there might be able to be a negotiation where China's concept of internationalizing the dispute can lead to maybe a UN kind of mandated area, an area that's truly international there, and maybe the Japanese are willing to give that up. There's not as much at stake in terms of gas, natural gas, and oil in the East China Sea as there is in the South China Sea.
It's more symbolic at this point.
That's right. It's more a sovereignty issue.
And what could the Japanese offer by way of any, I don't know, softening? I mean, get a little piece of it?
Right. So previously this was private. This is private. They could reprivatize it. They could sell it off to a Japanese citizen, and maybe the Japanese citizen would volunteer to set up a kind of an international tourist area, or I don't know, honestly. Good thing I'm not a diplomat, huh? But I do think there's a slight opening there, because the Chinese are committed to this approach, and the internationalization of this is interesting.
And they're pushing that part. Well, I mean, I think we've seen with this issue, it's a very important need to understand background, context, history, and why we study history, because it's alive today. It continues in the mind and in the perceptions, and the fueling the public opinion that we described earlier. You cannot understand these tensions that are very real and that can play out in important ways. They can affect economic issues. They can affect our relationship with the region. You need to know that the context of it, the history, and that historical context in turn is what is defining the geopolitical agenda. So it's alive and well. And we draw on history both to give us that context, but also what are the ways and maybe areas where you can see any given, any change. I want to thank you. This has been a great opportunity to unravel, and of course we haven't solved it, but it just means we have more opportunities to return, as surely these tensions will continue to evolve and unfold. But it's given us a great snapshot. Our listeners, I think, gained a deep understanding of this region of East Asia, China and Japan, two key players in that region, and a story that continues to unfold with history alive. I want to thank you, Jon. Jon Davidann has joined us today, a historian who's published many books, and particularly has a keen understanding of U.S. Japan relations. More recent book on cross-cultural encounters, obviously
true, yes.
on a more global perspective, but very well informed from the connections between Asia and the U.S., and that's what we're all about here in Global Connections. We help bring perspective, informed opinion, and help our listeners make sense of this crazy world that we're all part of. But it's important, and I want to thank our listeners for joining us today, and Jon for coming on board. I look forward to, we'll have to continue this conversation, bring you back when we have some more to engage on. And so thank you all for joining us here. This has been Global Connections in the ThinkTechHawaii, the ThinkTech series. We'll be coming back to you again, as always, reminding you that we have basically shows that are streamed, and you can catch any of these. If you've missed the live version, you can come back. Let me leave it at that, and look forward to joining us here next time. Thank you.